want to thank the Historic Landmarks Foundation and the museum, as well as the financial sponsors for this evening's program. I was delighted to be invited tonight to speak with you about the aspects of mid-century modernism that I know best, which happened to be the West Coast variant, and focused on the Case Study House program of Arts and Architecture magazine. I hope that this will help enrich everyone's understanding of the field and the phenomenon of mid-century modernism, which I know is very rich here in Indianapolis and in your state. And as I was talking to a couple of people before this evening's program, I mentioned that when I first moved to Chicago, one of the first places I went to see when I ventured out of Chicago was Columbus, Indiana. Because of course, you know, its fame as a center for innovation in modern architectural design is well known. So it was one of the first places that I wanted to see. I'm delighted to be back here this evening, and I'll begin with my first slides. The Case Study House program is something that may or may not be well known to many of you. As Mark sort of sketched out, it was a program of experimental residential modern house design that took place between 1945 and 1966, spearheaded by the magazine Arts and Architecture, which was a Los Angeles-based architecture, design, and art magazine devoted to modernism in all its permutations. And the Case Study House program produced some of the real landmark examples of American modernism. And in fact, I think that we can look at Los Angeles in this period, in this immediate post-World War II period, as a real sort of epicenter of modern design. And I'll talk a little bit about the precedents for modernism in that period, as well as some of the things that came afterwards, to give you all a better sense of context. But on the screen are two of the best-known examples of residential design that were produced as part of the Case Study House program. On your left, the Charles and Ray Eames House and Studio, which was completed in 1949. And on your right, the Pierre Koenig Case Study House number 22, designed and built approximately 10 years later in 1959. The program overall produced 36 designs, but only 24 were built. And I'll talk a little bit about the ones, both the built versions, some of which are very well known, and the unbuilt designs as I proceed in the discussion. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the exhibition that I did on this subject at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art in 1989, because I think that, you know, since we're holding this lecture in a museum setting, I think that you may find it interesting to hear about how some of this architecture was translated into an exhibition form. As my colleague Craig Miller knows so well, it's often quite, you know, difficult to present architecture in a museum setting, because you're always, you know, one step removed from the real thing. But we tried to do it in 1989 in Los Angeles, and I will refer to some of the attempts that we made to present the designs of this program in that context. Arts and Architecture magazine, as I mentioned, was really the driving force behind the Case Study House program. And it's really interesting that a magazine, a literary journal, so to speak, could take such a role. But the person behind the magazine was John Entenza, who you see on the right-hand side of the screen, the fellow with the glasses. He's standing there with Charles Eames. And John Entenza was somebody who had known Charles and Ray Eames at Cranbrook Academy of the Arts when they were together there in the late 1930s, and they had all gone out to Los Angeles, you know, in the late 30s, early 40s, sort of moving west to try to situate themselves in an environment which was considered, you know, sort of very experimental at the time, where a lot of creative individuals had migrated, many of whom were working in the film industry and in related kinds of contexts. And Entenza purchased the magazine that was called at that time California Arts and Architecture. You see one of the covers of the California version on the upper left-hand side of the screen, and you see the redesigned and reconfigured Arts and Architecture magazine that John Intenza conceived in the large image to the lower right, and I think you can immediately appreciate the difference. John Intenza purchased a magazine that was a fairly conventional sort of house and garden variety publication, and he turned it into a vehicle for the dissemination of ideas about modernism. And he was very much a devotee of all kinds of modernism. The graphic design of this cover, I think, is very bold, very striking. You see immediately in the typography and the bold blocks of color and the rectilinear sort of geometric format and a kind of emblematic sensibility of modernism. And the articles in the magazine are a really rich treasure trove of progressive thinking of all kinds. It's truly a sort of pleasure to go back to the issues of this magazine even today, because it's really a cohesive, very cohesive statement that was advancing a particular agenda, a particular way of thinking about the world, and how people ought to be living in the world at this moment in history, which was a really pivotal one in the 20th century. The thinking behind the magazine, and of course John Intenza's commitment to modernism and advancing it in the United States, has a history that I'm sure is quite familiar to many of you, but I want to point out the fact that the precedents for the mid-century modernism that we're focusing on this weekend lie much earlier in the 20th century and can or need to be considered in light of developments in European modernism early in the 20th century, particularly great examples like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie of 1927, which you see on the right. And I like to contrast this with a poster that was developed for a German housing exhibition, also in the 1920s in Stuttgart, where it's very clear, again, so the use of a graphic commentary on the kind of living that was no longer desired as part of modernism, a big red X on, sort of the more conventional, traditional, sort of cluttered, dark, Victorian sensibility that the modernist architects were reacting against. And I think this is it's a very compelling image that you see here that really, also very clearly communicates the attitudes that modern architects were putting forth. And of course, the early part of the 20th century has, all kinds of examples of progressive approaches by architects to new ways of living that would make use of advances in technology. Systems of prefabrication and industrialized approaches to building were very, very important in helping architects, imagine the way that people could live in the 20th century in a way that would really reflect the sensibility of that age. And I think it's always so difficult for us in our time to imagine what that must have felt like, what it must have been like to live at a time in history when things were changing so rapidly. The architects, with their visions for how this would impact people's daily lives, I think played such a critical role. And just a couple of examples that I wanted to point to include an early design by the architect Irving Gill, which you see on your left, in La Jolla, California. It's the Women's Club of La Jolla, and it was built in 1916, I believe. And you can see the construction process using tilt-up concrete, where concrete was poured into place and then lifted up to create, the walls of the structure. So that interest in a kind of, prefabricated, industrialized construction method was being applied here quite early on. And then, quite a bit later, we have Buckminster Fuller's design for the so-called Dymaxion House, which was a, completely sort of prefabricated, industrialized shelter that has a very peculiar form, sort of resembles a spaceship. But was another, really compelling example of the desire to create residences anew and in a way that would build upon and reflect and embody the spirit of progressive thinking in 20th century technological advance. Los Angeles in Southern California was really a location where this attitude was developed from very early on and applied from very early on in the 20th century. And these are two examples, both from the 1920s, of key works of modernism that were realized in LA, both of which are still there and are absolutely marvelous works of architecture. On the left is the Kingsroad House by Rudolph Schindler, which was designed and built in 1921 as a residence for him and his wife, and then another couple. It was actually a double house where the two families shared a communal kitchen and communal living spaces, but each had their own, private quarters. And the innovations, one of the great innovations of the Schindler House is how completely it opens up to nature. You can see that the wall sort of disappears, and the garden area is used as a kind of outdoor living room. And Schindler described this home as something between a cave and a tent. And he, as an emigre, as a European emigre to California, was particularly impressed by the climate of the region and felt that such a design was appropriate in an environment where people could literally live out of doors for large portions of the year. It's an extraordinary house, and if any of you have not seen it, you should if you visit Los Angeles, because it is open to the public. It's owned by a foundation currently, and in my opinion, it's one of the great works of the early 20th century. On the right is the Richard Neutra designed Lovell Health House, 1927, the same year as the Le Corbusier Villa Savoie that we saw previously. An extremely modern statement, constructed of steel, and with the sort of flat roof and the proliferation of glass, areas of glass. The home, is really, as it was sort of nicknamed the Health House, was really meant to reflect a kind of healthy, healthful way of living. And it was actually designed for a physician in Los Angeles who wrote a column for the Los Angeles Times called The Care of the Body. And he was a great proponent of fresh air and exercise, and that attitude and that kind of lifestyle was really embodied in the way the house was designed. So John Intenza had a lot to work with, or a lot to build on, when he decided to launch the Case Study House program in 1945. On your left is the cover of the magazine in which the case study program was announced, which I hope you can read down there at the bottom. And then on the right is a fragment of the description, which I'm sure you can't read very well. So I'm just going to choose a couple of sentences to let you know a bit more about how he articulated the effort and how he got it out there initially. He says that 8 nationally known architects, chosen not only for their obvious talents, but for their ability to evaluate realistically housing in terms of need, have been commissioned to take a plot of God's green earth and create good living conditions for 8 American families. They will be free to choose or reject on a merit basis the products of national manufacturers offering either old or new materials considered best for the purpose by each architect in his attempt to create contemporary dwelling units. And then he goes on to say more. But I think that what is sort of interesting about the way he is positing it is that these are very much going to be experiments. These are going to be testing grounds for a kind of approach to modernism that would take into account all the kinds of materials and appliances and advances and every sort of aspect that was available at that time. John Intenza actually did what he said in this article. He identified, or he invited 8 architects, most of whom were based in Southern California, but a couple who were not, to create designs for the typical American family. And he gave them really, not too much direction other than what I've read to you, except that the houses were meant to be prototypes for mass production. In other words, they should be able to be duplicated, to be replicated. Because his idea was to try to influence public taste and influence the building industry to accept modern architecture and to reproduce it on a broad scale in the post-war period. This was very much his goal. So other than that, he sort of let the architects do what they will, but he chose them very carefully, and he chose people who had already demonstrated in their work and in their ideas a commitment to modernism that he felt was sort of strong enough and right for the program. One of the first architects that he invited was named Julius Ralph Davidson, and you see 2 drawings of one of Davidson's case study house designs on the screen. This was case study number 1. The houses in the program each had a number. And this one was actually not built. One of the issues with the case study house program was that in some cases the architects had to invent their clients. They had to design a house for a hypothetical client. In other cases, there were actual clients that they could create a design for. In the case of J.R. Davidson's design, this was for a hypothetical couple. And it's sort of interesting to see how simple this design is, but it's quite typical of a modern architectural approach that depends on an open plan, an indoor-outdoor integration. And you can see in this drawing on your left, the opening up, the sliding of glass doors, opening up to a patio, and where the flooring surface from indoor to outdoor remains the same to make that sort of continuity. It's a small house. These were all meant to be small and economical, cheap, inexpensive. And it's probably difficult for you to read some of the inscriptions on the section drawing on the right, but it's very interesting to note the kinds of features of the home that J.R. Davidson envisioned. Of course, keep in mind that this was a house designed for people in Los Angeles, and with the prevalence of the film community there, he was of course thinking of his hypothetical clients as people who would be part of that community. And he designed the house to have a screen for projection and sort of hi-fi equipment that was very advanced at the time. Not the kind of thing that you would find in a typical house. And other features that were really meant to be sort of state-of-the-art, up to the minute. And he carefully delineated the place for every single object, every single item in his hypothetical home. This drawing of the kitchen that you see here on your right is one that I love because it's so detailed and so complete about the placement of every single object. And of course the kitchen, the design of this kitchen, it's very small, it's very compact. And one of the great skills of J.R. Davidson was to make this such a small, compact design very efficient and very sort of elegant in a sense, but with everything in its place, but only the things that you would need, the things that that a modern family would need. But he's designated places for not only the canned goods and the china, but also the brooms and down to the salt and pepper shakers. He's got those all delineated on the plan. J.R. Davidson had actually been a designer of cabins in ships, and so that attention to the need for a kind of compact planning and sort of a place for everything and everything in its place was very much a part of his vocabulary. Another interesting note that I should point out is in the drawing on the right, where you see the sort of the vanity area and the closet spaces. Again, very tight, very compact. Note the lighted ceiling, the flat plane of the ceiling with illumination above, an extremely modern feature at that time. And again, something that would not have been found in the typical home. Another early case study design was done by a Midwestern architect named Ralph Rapson. And Rapson is somebody whose work you may know because he spent most of his life and career working in Minneapolis. And he did some work in Chicago as well. He was known to John Intenza because they had connections through Cranbrook. And so Rapson was invited to contribute a case study design, and it was actually one of the most radical designs of the program. It was never built, but if it had been built, it would have been quite an amazing home. It was called the Greenbelt House, and it was called that because it literally contained a green belt, or a strip of green planting, almost like a park-like space in the interior of the home, which I think you can probably see better in the view of the model on your right. And perhaps in this drawing on the left, you get the sense of, in Rapson's wonderfully sort of whimsical drawings, how the positioning of this green belt could really be a central organizing feature for the house. And you see, what a young girl looks like the family's, teenage daughter, sort of hoeing a vegetable garden that seems to be, sort of directly a central feature of the house, and you see the two parents sitting in the the living room area conversing. It's really kind of a wonderful concept. This house was one of two full-scale models of case study house designs that we replicated for the exhibition that I curated at Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art in 1989. And so on your right is a view into the reconstructed version of the house that we presented at that time. And it was one of, well, both of these designs and their recreations we found were really wonderful ways to communicate the character of the architecture to a museum-going public in an exhibition context. And it was particularly interesting to try to realize the Rapson house at full scale because it had never been built and because it existed really only in sketch form, largely. So it took some doing on the part of our designers and our technical staff at LA MoCA, and I think that they did an amazing job. I'll show you a few more images of it as we go through. For instance, the living room area that you just saw in the sketch was recreated as such, and we were able to borrow, original objects of the period that appeared in the designs. And took a few liberties as well too, trying to sketch the whole thing out. But the designers of our show were so sort of committed to giving a complete picture of this vision for post-war living that we actually included a Jeep parked outside the house and next to the garbage cans, and really made it a complete environment for our public to walk into. People were able to walk into the house and tour it as you would tour a regular house. And in fact, that was one of the great innovations, I think, of the Case Study House program, is that when each house design was announced in the magazine, it was then followed up with the progress of the construction of the design if the house was built. And then when it was complete, the house was open for public tour, and it was publicized in the magazine. So Intenza really used that as a vehicle to try to, bring people into these houses so that they could see what they were like, appreciate them, and then, of course, his goal would be that they would want one. This is an example of the sketch of the kitchen in the Rapson house that we had to work with for the recreation in our exhibition. And it was really quite an undertaking, but as I mentioned, a very, very interesting and successful one. As the program developed, more and more of the houses were actually built. In the very beginning, in 1945, when the program was launched, it was difficult to actually realize things because there was still a shortage of building materials. It was difficult to get, for people to get construction going in the immediate post-war period. It took a little time. So this design by Richard Neutra was actually, even though it was case study number 20, it was one of the first designs of the program that was actually built. And you can see how small, how modestly scaled the house is in the image on the right. It was really, very compact, very tiny. And Neutra was probably the best known architect at the time to participate in the program. He had had an established career since the 1920s in the United States. On the left is an image of his case study house. We're in the living room, sort of looking out to the outdoor living area. And you can appreciate, how compact it is, but how it appears to be much more expansive, much more spacious because of the integration with the outdoors and the large expanses of glass. I think it's so interesting that an architect like Neutra in about the same year could design a case study house which was very low cost for a young family, a dentist, his wife, and their toddlers. And he could also design at the same time the much more elegant, much more opulent and expensive and spacious home in Palm Springs for Edgar Kaufman, Jr. And that's the Kaufman house on the right. But even though the houses were done for very different clients at a very different economic level, they have such similar features. And those attributes are the same. The flat roof, the open plan, the integration with the outdoors, the large expanses of glass, a flowing, open sensibility between indoors and outdoors. One of the best known of the case studies, of course, is the Charles and Ray Eames house, first designed in 1945 but not completed until 1949. And this was the home and studio of Charles and Ray, a husband and wife team of designers who are who need no further commentary to this audience, I'm sure. They're, such major figures in the 20th century. And again, their house, in my view, is one of the, top 5 examples of residential architecture in the 20th century. It's an incredible, incredible environment. You see Charles and Ray sitting in the interior of their home after it was built, where you can see, it's sort of, fully furnished with, artworks, plants, all kinds of artifacts that the couple collected, and the exterior of the home, which is remarkable because, like many of the case studies, it was built using industrial materials, materials meant for commercial purposes, not for residential construction necessarily. And so such a house could, in less skilled hands, be quite austere. In the hands of Charles and Ray Eames, the house is incredibly lively, incredibly beautiful through the use of color, the bold primary color, the blues, the reds, areas of gold paint. The diagonal cross brace, which is actually not structural. It doesn't need to be there. It's a visual device to give interest to the facade of the house. And in so many other ways, this completely sort of technologically designed box becomes a very beautiful shelter for the life of individuals whose interests were incredibly wide-ranging. The original design for the Charles and Ray Eames house was very different, and on the right you see a drawing of how they first envisioned the house. It was to be a single-story pavilion that was to cantilever out from the hillside site on which it was designed. And you see a little sketch of their first design in relationship to the neighboring house on the left side of the screen. They decided to change the house, though, just before all the materials were delivered to the site, because they wanted to enclose more space. And using the exact same amount of materials that they had ordered for their original house, they were able to instead create 2 double-height pavilions, one a living space and one a studio space. So they really did achieve a much larger area than they would have initially, but using all the same parts, which I think is rather brilliant. And there are Charles and Ray standing in the frame of their house under construction in 1949. In our exhibition, we decided to try to mock up a portion of the Eames house because we felt it was so important to the case study program, but we didn't do it as a full-scale, fully furnished reconstruction as the others. Instead, we did it as a kind of schematic framework because we thought what was most interesting, perhaps, was the structure of the house, the height of the house, and then, of course, the relationship between the architectural design and the furnishings and other objects which were designed by the Eameses during their prolific career. So we juxtaposed this sort of skeletal mock-up with examples of Eames furnishings and works of art designed by Ray. She was actually the artist in the couple. In 1950, the architect Rafael Soriano designed a case study house, which really was a great example of a kind of a pure technological expression. Soriano was very committed to the use of steel in housing design. And you see him, looking very serious as he studies his plans on the site of the building. And a couple of views of the case study house that he designed, where you can see the structure being, sort of very simple, extremely simple, and rather austere from the exterior. And of course, one of the characteristic features of these houses is that they were quite closed to the street, but they were open in the back and very open in the interior. One of the interesting things about this house is that the interior was actually embellished with the use of materials such as brick, and wood paneling and carpeting and other features that made it a little bit more palatable to the general consumer. By this time, the case study houses were sort of getting out there, and a number of them had been built. And in Soriano's case, it's interesting to observe that dialogue between the austerity of the facade and the relative comfort of the interior. And that was something that Intenza realized was important to try to continue to get his message across. In the 1950s, there was a sort of great proliferation of wonderful case study designs. The architect Craig Elwood was one of the key contributors to case studies during this time, and he had a very elegant touch. I would say that of all the case study architects, he was the one who was the closest to Mies van der Rohe in his sensibility. Craig Elwood was trained as an engineer, incidentally, so he also sort of brought that sensibility of construction to his residential design. This is on the left is a view of the facade of his case study house of 1952, which you can see is screened from the street by translucent panels, allowing light to filter in, but enabling privacy for the residents. And on the other side of the house, you can see how it opens up to the garden space. And a couple additional views of the living space, interior, and the patio area that was very much part of the environment of this home. And again, I want to emphasize, or it cannot be emphasized enough, how important the climate was in furthering the articulation of these modern house designs and in really turning the architects toward the use of outdoor spaces as a really integral part of the living environment for each family. But I think you can sort of appreciate something of the elegance of Elwood's design. You see the column sort of painted red, that sort of slender column. And you also see the presence of a kind of heavy stonework that gives some interest and texture to the material quality of the house. And of course, by this time, advances in consumer products, were much more widespread and much more easily available. And the kitchens of the case study houses in this period, become really kind of significant. The latest, models of refrigerator, dishwasher, cabinetry, all those kinds of things became utilized more and more by the case study architects. On the right, I think it's a very sort of beautiful view of a wonderful relationship between interior and exterior, where you have in this bedroom the continuation of the wall of the room going out into the courtyard, and then an enclosed courtyard space, so that this bedroom has really a quite substantial extension visually and physically into the outdoors. Another design by Elwood. And at this time also you begin to see quite a number of swimming pools incorporated in the designs of the houses, and that's not just because there was enough land to include them, but because the lifestyle and the way people lived at this time became more and more sort of oriented to leisure activities. A third design by Craig Elwood reveals the growth of the case study houses at this time in square footage. And again, this reflects very much the improvement or the improved economic circumstances of the typical American family in the mid-1950s, as opposed to the immediate post-war period. This house had 4 bedrooms, I believe, and was quite expansive. You can see the contours of the plan and how it's organized around a swimming pool, which is really a key feature of the design. At this time, it's very interesting to think about how the furnishings of modernism that were found in so many of the case study houses and in other modern house designs were being publicized and popularized. On the left is a view of a page from Arts and Architecture magazine, where you have images of the designers of objects such as lamps and indoor-outdoor furniture and other types of elements that would fit comfortably in the interiors of case study houses. And then on the right, you see the cover of the Los Angeles Times Home magazine, which is, of course, would have been read by, many, many more people, where these same artifacts, these same objects are presented as a sort of exemplar of the way that people could live at this time. And they were really wonderful, wonderful objects. Another key case study architect of the 1950s was Pierre Koenig, who produced 2 really significant case study house designs, and they were both very rigorous almost to the point of severity, especially this design of 1958, I believe, case study number 21, a view of the steel construction, an aerial perspective of the house as built. And one of the key aspects of this house, as you can see from these finished photographs, was the complete avoidance of any overhang. There's no overhang on this house. It's just, you know, very a sort of straightforward drop from the roof to the wall plane. And to counteract that, to give, you know, something of a, well, to help cool the house, for one, Koenig came up with a system where water would circulate around the perimeter of the house. It would be pumped up to the roof, and then it would sort of splash down. And I think you can possibly see some of the, you know, the streams of water coming down in the slide on your right. And it was a way to, you know, not just cool the house, but also to sort of enliven it a bit. But an extremely, you know, kind of severe design, but one of great beauty, using, you know, industrial steel decking and steel framing. The shot of the kitchen, I think, is wonderful because, you know, we not only have the latest appliances, but we also have this great sort of lemon yellow color, and it's, you know, very vibrant. And the night view of the home, of course, with the, you know, the car, a car that would have been, you know, the kind of car that people who would inhabit such homes would drive at the time, parked in the driveway. So it becomes a sort of representation of a certain kind of lifestyle that at this moment had become, you know, sort of much more widespread, or something that more and more people were interested in emulating and participating in. And then, of course, this is one of my favorite photographs. I think this is an absolutely marvelous representation of the case study houses. This is a photograph by the eminent photographer Julius Schindler, who played a huge role in disseminating information about the case study houses. And I must read to you a brief quote about this photograph. It's been extensively analyzed in the literature on this period. A historian named Oriol Lucero writes about this, and I should point out that actually the man in the photograph is the architect. It's Pierre Koenig, sort of standing in for the husband of this woman who is actually a model, a hired model. So Lucero writes, "Koenig does not appear as the home's architect. Rather, he is the non-specific husband with his fictional wife, who together exemplify the hopes of the post-war utopia. Like the droves of couples who migrated to Southern California after the war, the man and wife in Schulman's photo appear as if they have realized in Los Angeles their search for the good life. Schulman also represents the ideal household by way of the gender relationship depicted in case study house number 21. The woman sits on the couch as a testament to her domesticity, while the man operates the stereo as proof of his familiarity with the modern and mechanical. Like viewers who desire the newest and best products for their home, this non-specific couple appears as the ideal consumers representative of their class." And I think that's a great analysis, because so much of what is interesting to us today about these houses, besides their, you know, their architectural qualities, is the sort of the sensibility that they stand for. And to me, it's so interesting how you know, a situation is sort of represented through the use of these characters. It becomes almost like a still from a movie. And Julius Schindler was masterful at sort of creating environments, using using people in architectural photographs in a way that few other architectural photographers did, to try to sort of humanize the architecture. And I think he did an absolutely brilliant job with that. We'll see this photo again towards the end of my presentation. The other case study house designed by Pierre Koenig is perhaps even more famous than the other. This is case study house number 22, which you know, continues to be used in many film shoots. I see commercials on television today, which, you know, are shot in this house. It is so dramatic, and it's such a, you know, sort of marvelous representation of modernism that it continues to be used even today as a really outstanding residential design. The house was indeed incredibly dramatic. It was made from, you know, steel and glass. Those are the materials of this house, and the panels of glass were 20 feet wide. They were, I think, the largest available glass windows one could find at that time, and these enormous sheets of steel decking, industrial steel decking. The plan of the house was L-shaped. It was extremely simple, and it was organized around a swimming pool. But what's most sort of exciting about this house is its site. It is perched on a hilltop overlooking Los Angeles. So when you are in that house, you're surrounded just by glass, and the city sort of spreads out below your feet, and it's absolutely incredible. So at the time it was built, it was extremely dramatic. It continues to be dramatic today, and it was the second case study design that we mocked up in full scale in our exhibition. And so what you're looking at on the right is our recreation of the house. And if you look above the roof in that image on the right, you'll see the ceiling of the building that it was inside. And you can also maybe make out that the swimming pool, as we mocked it up, was created simply by a big sheet of plastic pulled tight. But it really worked. It kind of worked. And again, it was an environment that people could walk into and experience that way. Oh, another view of the recreation where the illusion of the swimming pool, I think, is a little bit more apparent. You see the stretch of the piece of plastic. But again, all the furnishings were, we borrowed the furnishings that we needed that matched the photographs. So it was a very sort of methodical undertaking to really make it, to give it as much veracity as possible and to keep it as close as possible to the original. The floor plan of our exhibition, which I wanted to show you just because we divided the space into a nighttime zone and a daytime zone. And the Koenig house was positioned in the nighttime zone. And the two zones were separated by a large wall of corrugated metal, sort of simple corrugated sheet metal that divided the space into two halves and that gave us plenty of additional space to exhibit the scale models, photographs, drawings, artifacts, a timeline of the period. We really tried to treat this moment in complete depth and in every way to pull out of it, sort of every sort of, design, architectural, and even artistic aspect of the period that corresponded to modernism. Towards the end of the program, it continued to produce very noteworthy examples, and not all of them were steel and glass structures. Some of them were made from wood, and they had a more conventional appearance, yet they were no less modern. They were not as overtly technological, but they were still extremely modern in their vocabulary. This house, for instance, was designed by a team of architects called Buff, Straub, and Hensman, a three-person partnership. And the clients for this house were the graphic designer Saul Bass, who designed many titles for Hollywood films, and his wife, who was a biochemist. You see a drawing of the house that shows you, how it's laid out, and you see on the right a view of the construction where plywood, where wooden sort of molded barrel vaulted forms made of wood created a kind of canopy structure over the main space of the house. The framing was wood throughout, but the presence of these curving elements gave a very graceful, sort of open aspect to the house, and then those circular, those rounded forms were echoed elsewhere in the design. For instance, the fireplace structure is a kind of ovoid form, which is quite prominent and demarcates the boundary between indoors and outdoors. And then, of course, I love the fact that the house sort of encloses within its rafters a gigantic tree, so that sort of becomes part of the house design, and it has a much more organic quality than many of the case studies. And this aspect of the case study program is not as well known as the emphasis on steel construction and on prefabricated technology and on elements that were not as conventional in residential design at the time. But this is, I think, a very important aspect of the case study program. Here's a view of that same house where you see the lady of the house working in the kitchen. And an interesting thing, and I think a very characteristic thing, is how open the kitchen is to the rest of the house. I mean, the woman can be cooking using the sink or whatnot, and then just sort of turn, pass the food through to the living room, or have an area there where people can pull up a chair and eat. And of course, these are features that we've become so commonplace that we take for granted, but at the time, extremely novel. Towards the very end of the program, some of the architects ventured into multiple housing. And this example is a very interesting one. It was a tract of 3 houses related to one another. It was called the Triad, and it's situated in La Jolla, California, which is about 2 hours south of Los Angeles. 3 houses designed by the same architects, Killingsworth, Brady, and Smith was the name of their firm. And here on the left, you're standing in the entry of one house looking up at the adjacent one. And you have the opposite view on the other side of the screen. And 2 views of 2 of the houses in the tract, so they weren't identical. One, for instance, was wood. Well, actually, they were all wood construction, but the one here on the left was wood painted white. So it sort of resembled the white painted steel of some of the other case studies. And then on the right, you have a house where the wood is left and it's sort of more natural color. So there was that kind of variety and interplay, visually and formally, within the components of this particular tract. And then some of the last houses in the program became demonstration houses for particular companies and their materials. This house on the left was a demonstration house for Bethlehem Steel, which provided all the materials for free. And on the right, it was a brick company that, I don't remember the name of it, but they provided the materials to be used in that house on the right, which was primarily of brick. Both houses by this time, and this is the early 1960s, both houses quite large, very spacious, many bedrooms, large spaces, unlike those, compact, efficient, low-cost, economical houses of the first part of the case study program. And then one of the very interesting designs, I think, in the program, which was never built, was the design for a whole tract of case study houses by the architect A. Quincy Jones. And this house was meant to be partially underground. You can maybe see that in the model. And then you also see how Jones gave the illusion of a proliferation of these houses, a real tract of the houses, through his photography of a single model surrounded by mirrors. Maybe you can see a line in the corner there. You see the mirrors coming together. And the photograph was meant to suggest how numerous variations of this house could coexist in a single plot. Situating the house partially underground was done for several reasons. Jones was thinking about the fact that this would provide visual privacy and reduce the sound that would travel from one house to the next if they were, adjacent to one another in a tract. He also thought about how this would help the house be cool in the summer and warmer in the winter. So, sort of an early proponent of sustainability before it became popular, but sort of really thinking about how that direct relationship with the earth would help those ventilation and cooling features. But unfortunately, this tract was not built. What did happen in the post-World War II period is that many tract houses were built. We're looking at, on the left, a view of one of the Levitt towns that were built around the U.S., in many parts of the U.S., in the post-World War II period, where builders had got hold of large tracts of land and were able to realize many cheap houses using conventional construction methods. And this was one of the downfalls of the case study program. There was just not enough sort of familiarity or will on the part of the builders to construct houses out of steel and to try to retool their processes to construct houses that were technologically advanced. There wasn't the incentive there. It didn't make good enough economic sense at the time, and they just wanted to put up as many houses as they could as quickly and efficiently as possible because there was a tremendous need. So this kind of tract, became sort of typical of what happened in the United States in the post-World War II period. And then, of course, in Europe, you had, multiple housing, high-rises, which were built much more frequently than here in the US. But of course, you also did have examples such as Mies van der Rohe's Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago, built in 1949, the same year as the Charles and Ray Eames house, and his beautiful gem-like Farnsworth house outside of Chicago, which was also, I think, 1949-50. One of the, I'm sure all of you have seen it, and if you haven't, please go. It's again, another one of the top 5, in my view, residential designs of mid-century modern architecture. I want to conclude by emphasizing that the case study program is just one chapter. It's just one sort of easily defined chapter in the history of mid-century modern architecture in this country and in Los Angeles. And what I've thought about a great deal since I curated the exhibition originally is how much was left out of the case study program. There were many, many, many talented modern architects who were, building all kinds of innovative and interesting structures around the area who did not participate in the case study program because they were not invited by John Intenza. So consequently, their work, in many cases, did not receive as much publicity and didn't become as well known as the case study architects' work because of the vehicle of arts and architecture, which was nationally and internationally read and consumed eagerly by any architect, designer, or artist or creative, progressive person interested in modernism. So some of these architects, I think, suffered a bit, but recent scholarship is bringing them more and more to the forefront. For instance, the architect Gregory Ain was a very important mid-century figure. He designed a number of excellent houses and was very committed to the idea of social housing, multiple housing, and he designed modern tract houses in and around Los Angeles. And the architect Albert Frey is an incredible figure who built a lot of work in the Palm Springs area. One of his really extraordinary houses is seen in the photograph on the left. Rudolph Schindler, who did the extraordinary Kingsroad house in the 1920s, continued to build astonishingly interesting houses through the 1950s when he passed away. And this is one of his late houses, which is sort of an incredible hillside structure. It looks like it's about to collapse, but it actually is sort of very representative of the sensibility of using simple materials to create sort of rich environment, which is very connected to the outdoors and the landscape around it. And of course, John Lautner, the quite celebrated architect whose designs were extremely extraordinary, very futuristic in some cases and forward-looking. This is the 1960 Chemosphere house, which continues to be lived in today. It's actually owned by the publisher Benedict Taschen, who produces many books on modern architecture. So he's a real enthusiast and one of the key people to sort of help the preservation effort for houses of this kind. The case study house program had a lot of influence on another generation of architects that followed. And one of those architects is Frank Gehry. You may not be aware that Frank Gehry was a student of some of the case study architects who taught at the University of Southern California in the 1950s. And on the left is one of Frank Gehry's earliest house designs, dates from 1959. And I think it's very much indebted to the case study architects, very much in that idiom. And I think that he was really shaped in his early thinking about using unconventional materials in simple ways, cost-effective ways, and being inventive in that way, which manifested itself in his own house design of 1972. You see that on the right, that's the Gehry house in Santa Monica, where he used corrugated metal and chain link fencing to make an extension of a bungalow house from much earlier in the century. So even though in form the character is different, I think the sensibility is the same. It's this sort of ethos of experimentation and invention with using simple industrial materials that might not have otherwise been considered appropriate for a residential design. And I have to get back to these two images. The early vision of Ralph Rapson, who imagined a family sitting in their home, in their greenbelt home, filled with fresh air and completely open between interior and exterior. And the vision of, Julius Schindler, the photographer, in his photograph of Pierre Koenig's house. And I think that these images are so emblematic, and I wanted to conclude with another view, because when we're talking about, I think all of us here are, considering this weekend, the preservation of modernism and the interest that mid-century modernism has today. And something I think that's so fascinating is how this vocabulary has persisted in popular culture, because that, sort of keeps it alive in many, many people's minds. And I love the fact that a photo essay was published in W magazine a few years ago, featuring Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, directly quoting this photograph by Julius Schindler of the Pierre Koenig house design, but of course taking it a little bit farther, as we would think that they would. Brad Pitt, for example, is an incredible enthusiast of mid-century modernism. In Los Angeles, it's fortunate that a number of people in the film industry today are, keenly interested in modernism, have bought many of the mid-century houses, have restored them immaculately, and have sort of perpetuated a keen interest in this genre of residential architecture. So that really helps the awareness of the importance and the elegance and the beauty of this genre of mid-century residential design. So I think that is my last image. Yes, it is. I appreciate your attention this evening. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.